For 3 straight days, Aaron had a front row seat to the end of his world. He just watched through the station's main viewport as another one of his cities was wiped off the map in a silent, blinding flash. The invaders, the Cravath, weren't just winning. They were erasing his entire culture from existence, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Seriously, what would you do if you knew your civilization had only a few hours left to live? Let me know in the comments, because Aaron was completely out of options. In the council chamber, half the seats were chillingly empty, a memorial to the leaders they'd already lost. "Give me the fleet status," Aaron said, his own voice sounding like a stranger's. Lisa's hands trembled over her console. "We have 17 defense cruisers left and maybe 40 smaller patrol ships." Against the Cravath's fleet of more than 300 warships, that wasn't a fight, it was a firing squad. The Dolin were never warriors. They were explorers, scientists, and artists. Their ships were designed for charting stars and protecting trade routes, not for fighting a galactic war. The Cravath, on the other hand, lived for conquest. They'd spent centuries carving a bloody empire across the stars. "What's the status on the evacuation transports?" Aaron asked, turning to his top scientist. "The last one jumped to hyperspace an hour ago," Lisa whispered. "We managed to get about 40,000 people out before they set up the blockade." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush you. That means 12 million people are still on the planet. 12 million souls about to be snuffed out because he couldn't save them. He had tried diplomacy. He had even offered to surrender. The Cravath commander just laughed in his face. They didn't want the planet. They wanted to make the Dolin an example, a terrifying warning to the rest of the galaxy of what happens when you defy them. Just then, the entire station lurched as an explosion hit nearby. Crimson emergency lights painted the room in a hellish glow, and another friendly ship vanished from the map, taking 200 more of his people with it. "Commander Drexen is hailing us again," the communications officer said, his face ashen. Aaron squared his shoulders. On screen, the face that appeared was pure predator. Drexen had the scaly skin, 4 cold black eyes, and a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth that his species was infamous for, and he was smiling. "Well, Counselor Aaron, have you finally come to your senses and decided to offer your unconditional surrender?" Aaron's voice was pure ice. "We both know you left me nothing to surrender." Drexen's grin grew wider. "I know, but I still want to hear you beg. I want to hear the leader of the Dolin Republic admit that you were just a bug on my windshield. You should have accepted our offer to become our subjects when you had the chance." "We said no because we don't believe in being slaves." "Slaves, subjects, they're just words," Drexen hissed. "The only thing that matters is power, and you have none. We always win." He leaned in, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "Your pathetic little fleet will be space dust in less than an hour. Then I'm sending my soldiers down to your cities. I've heard Dolin are delicate. My troops are very eager to find out just how delicate." Aaron fought to keep his rage from boiling over. "There are galactic laws. The Council forbids targeting civilians. The Galactic Council is a 3-month journey from here, and they're too scared to challenge us anyway," Drexen scoffed. "By the time they get around to writing a strongly worded complaint, your entire species will be nothing but a forgotten history lesson." The transmission cut out. leaving the room in a dead, heavy silence. Everyone was looking at Aaron, their eyes silently pleading for a miracle he knew he couldn't deliver. "Counselor," Lisa started, her voice barely a whisper. "There might be one last thing, a final, desperate gamble we haven't considered." "What is it?" "We've tried everything. The ancient beacon." The words seemed to make the air grow cold. It was more myth than protocol, a strange relic from a time before his people had even learned to fly. It was a massive, mysterious device left behind by the legendary Old Ones, the first race that discovered faster-than-light travel before they vanished without a trace 10,000 years ago. "That beacon hasn't been turned on in all of recorded history," Aaron shot back. "We have no idea if it even works." "The old records say it's a universal distress call," Lisa insisted, pulling up a hologram of glowing ancient text. "It blasts a message for help in every language known, on every frequency, to every corner of the galaxy." "A message to who? The Old Ones are long gone, Lisa." "I know," she said, pointing to a specific passage, "but the records mention something else." "They talk about those who sleep in the dark between the stars and the guardians from the world of death. The Old Ones believed that if anyone ever answered the call, it would be them." "That sounds like a scary bedtime story, Lisa." "Maybe it is," she replied, her gaze begging him to take the chance. "But what other choice do we have? We're going to die anyway, Aaron. At least this way we can go down screaming." Another massive explosion rocked the station, this one so close it threw them from their feet. The Cravath were closing in for the kill. Aaron didn't hesitate. "Do it! Turn it on!" They raced through deserted corridors to a chamber 3 levels down, a room he hadn't seen since he was a kid on a school trip. In the center of the room stood a giant, crystalline tower, pulsing with a soft internal light, like the heartbeat of a sleeping titan. Lisa rushed to a control panel covered in a thick layer of dust, her fingers flying across controls that hadn't been touched for thousands of years. A deep, powerful hum began to vibrate up through the floor, a sound you felt in your bones. "Is it working?" Aaron yelled over the growing noise. "I think so. The text says it just broadcasts on a loop once it's powered on. It won't stop until it gets a response, or we lose power." "And how long will the station's power last?" "At this point, maybe 3 years. 3 years of shouting for help into an empty universe, hoping someone might be listening." Aaron knew they wouldn't even last 3 more hours. On the chamber's monitor, they watched the final heartbreaking moments of the battle. Their last few ships fought with unbelievable courage, but they were being ripped apart one by one. As Aaron and Lisa watched their last defender get blown to bits, the beacon behind them pulsed with a massive wave of energy, sending its silent scream for help out into the cold, uncaring void. But far, far away, in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, something heard it. And on a small, blue world that everyone else had written off, an alarm began to scream. Admiral Helen Cross was unbelievably bored. She was trapped in her office at United Earth Defense Command, buried under a mountain of paperwork that a junior officer should have been handling. This was the boring reality of peacetime. Humanity's massive military fleet spent most of its days on pointless patrol routes, guarding a border that no one ever dared to approach. 200 years ago, When humans finally achieved faster than light travel, the Galactic Council had welcomed them and then immediately drew a quarantine line around their solar system. They called it a cultural observation. The real reason? Humanity scared the living daylights out of every other species out there. A piercing alarm from her desk terminal cut through the silence. It was a code red alert from the deep space listening array on Pluto. Admiral, you have to hear this. We're getting a signal, but it's not like anything in our database. It's coming through on all channels in thousands of languages, including perfect modern English. Helen shot up in her chair, her boredom vaporizing. What's the message? It's a distress call, ma'am. The technology is ancient, but the signal is incredibly powerful. It's coming from the outer spiral arm, about 800 light-years from here. The computer has a translation. It's from a civilization called the Doline Republic. They're saying they're being exterminated and are begging for help from anyone who can hear them. The Doline? Never heard of them. They aren't in any of our official records, Admiral. According to the galactic maps we have, their system is on the far side of Council territory. Way on the other side of the line they told us never to cross. A fire Helen hadn't felt in decades ignited in her gut. Get me President Garcia on a secure line now, and I want every piece of intel we have on that entire sector. 20 minutes later, Helen was in the command center, the president and the Joint Chiefs watching the main view screen. Counselor Aaron's desperate voice echoed through the room. Our world is being annihilated by the Creveth Dominion. Our fleet has been destroyed. Millions of our people are being slaughtered. We are sending this message hoping that someone, anyone, will hear our final plea. Please. If there is anyone out there who still believes in doing the right thing, who believes in justice, we are begging you. Help us. We are almost out of time. The recording started over again, the ghost of a dying man's plea crossing the stars. The Creveth Dominion, an intelligence officer stated. They're a major threat, a brutal empire that's already conquered about 40 systems. The Council is too terrified of them to intervene. President Garcia looked directly at Helen. If we were to intervene, could we even get there in time? If we launch our rapid response fleet right now, we can be there in 72 hours. But, Madam President, the Council will see this as an act of war. They drew that line for a reason. So, do we need to ask permission to answer an SOS? Legally, not a single person. There's an ancient galactic charter that says any species capable of helping has to answer a genuine distress call. But we'd be the first ones in history to actually do it. Garcia just stared at the star map, at the tiny distant light labeled the Doline Republic, a civilization all alone and about to be extinguished. How many ships can you get in the air? It was the question Helen had been waiting to hear her whole life. A fierce smile touched her lips. Give me 4 hours and I'll have 6 battle fleets ready to jump. That's 36 heavy cruisers, 72 destroyers, and 200 support ships. She let that hang in the air. And the Ragnarok. The room fell completely silent. Everyone knew the legends of the Ragnarok, the top-secret experimental dreadnought humanity built using forbidden technology, a ship so powerful the Galactic Council deemed it too dangerous to exist. It was, without question, the single largest warship humanity had ever conceived, armed with weapons that would make the so-called civilized races of the galaxy sick to their stomachs. "Do it, Garcia," the Admiral ordered. "Launch everything. I want every single ship we have on that mission." Helen, the communications officer, couldn't hide the huge grin spreading across her face. "Yes, ma'am." 4 hours later, Admiral Helen Cross was on the command bridge of her flagship, the UEES Valiant. Through the massive viewport, she watched her fleet assemble in flawless formation, a deadly ballet of steel and fire perfected over 2 centuries of relentless training. Humanity hadn't fought a real war in generations, but they had never once forgotten how. Her second-in-command, Captain Dan Reed, stepped onto the bridge. He was young for a captain, just 35, but he'd proven his worth in countless war simulations. More importantly, he was one of the last officers who still truly understood the reason the fleet even existed. "Admiral, all ships are reporting green. We're ready to depart on your order." "Excellent," she said, her voice firm as iron. "Send a message to the Dolin. Tell them help is coming. Then get us underway." In a blinding flash of blue light, the entire fleet vanished. Behind them, Earth was just a peaceful blue sphere. Ahead of them lay a rescue mission that could reshape the entire galaxy. They were barely 3 hours into their journey when a frantic message blasted in from Galactic Council headquarters. The image of Ambassador Thesson, a tall, bird-like alien whose entire job was to keep humanity in line, flickered onto the main view screen. He looked like he was about to have a full-blown meltdown. "Admiral Cross, we're tracking your fleet's warp signature. You must turn back immediately." "We're responding to a distress call, Ambassador. Galactic law is crystal clear on this." "You don't get it," he chirped, his voice straining. "The Dolin situation is a private Dominion matter. The Kravath have claimed that sector. The Council has already decided to remain neutral." Helen's jaw tightened. "Well, it's a good thing we're not a part of the Council, isn't it?" "Admiral, please." The ambassador's feathers were completely flared out, a dead giveaway of his terror. "Your entire species was quarantined for a reason. You evolved on a death world." "Do you have any clue what that really means? Your planet's gravity is nearly twice the galactic standard. Your weather is a series of rolling catastrophes. Your native predators would be classified as biological weapons on most civilized planets. You are physically built to thrive in an environment that would kill most of us within minutes." "I'm familiar with Earth's classification," she replied, her voice turning to ice. "Then you must understand that the moment you arrive in Dolin space, you will terrify them. And when you engage the Kravath, you will horrify them. The way you people wage war, it's deeply unsettling to the rest of the galaxy. You use solid chunks of metal, chemical explosives, and strategies that depend on a tolerance for pain that other species can't even fathom. We didn't lock you away because you're evil. We locked you away because we have no idea how to handle a species of natural-born survivors who refuse to play by our polite little rules." Helen could feel her temper starting to rise. "So you'd rather stand by and watch millions of innocent people be slaughtered than risk us upsetting some of your delicate friends?" The ambassador squeezed his eyes shut in utter defeat. "I'm trying to warn you. There's no coming back from this. The galaxy is about to see what humanity is really made of, and they will be terrified of you. Let them be, Helen shot back. We're going. Then I will pray the Dolene survive what you bring, Thesson whispered. And I'll pray the rest of us survive, knowing that the humans have finally been let off their leash. The transmission cut out. Dan glanced at Helen, his face etched with worry. Think he's right? That we'll scare them? Probably, she said without a second's hesitation. But people are dying, Dan, and they asked for our help. That's all that matters. She turned back to the star-dusted view before them. Besides, maybe it's time the galaxy learned a little something about who we really are. We may have come from a death world, but that doesn't make us monsters. It just makes us very, very good at protecting those who can't protect themselves. The fleet tore through the silent void, 72 hours to save a species they had never met, 72 hours to prove the quarantine was the galaxy's single greatest mistake. 72 hours until the universe found out what happens when you wake a sleeping giant. When the human fleet ripped out of warp on the edge of Dolene space, it was as if a ghost army had materialized from nothing. Deep inside the command bunker, Counselor Aaron flinched as a totally new alarm began to shriek. His people had already learned to tell the difference between the siren for an incoming Cravath bombing run and the one for something new. This was the something new alarm. Counselor, we're picking up massive energy readings at the system's edge. Scans show 38 capital-class vessels and over 200 smaller ships. Their design is completely alien. Their tech is unreadable. But they are not Kravoth. Aaron's heart hammered against his ribs. The beacon. Someone had actually heard their final desperate prayer. Are they friendly? We don't know. They're just holding their position in a tight defensive grid. Hold on. We're being hailed, audio only. The voice that echoed through the bunker was unlike anything Aaron had ever heard. Even through the universal translator, he could feel the raw power in it, the absolute unwavering confidence. This is Captain Dan Reed of the United Earth ship Valiant. We are answering your distress signal. We're here to help. Please confirm you can hear this transmission. Earth. Aaron racked his brain but came up empty. Lisa, search the databases. Is there any record of a species called humans from a planet named Earth? Lisa's fingers were already flying across her console. Nothing in the modern library, sir. Let me try the deep archives. From the era of the first ones. A moment later, she gasped. I've got one hit. It's filed under mythology. It speaks of the sleepers from the death world of Terra. She looked up from her screen, her eyes wide. Terra is an ancient name for Earth. The record says they were guardians, beings from the forgotten darkness between the stars. That's it. The first ones encountered them once and immediately declared their entire solar system forbidden territory. The classification is Deathworld, Class 12. Class 12? A wave of cold fear washed over Aaron. He had never heard of a classification higher than Class 8. In the name of the stars, what does Class 12 mean? Lisa looked as if she'd seen a ghost. It means the planet is so lethally hostile that attempting to visit is officially classified as an act of suicide. Counselor, I think we may have just summoned something far, far worse than the Kravoth. But they were already doomed. Aaron made up his mind. Open a channel. Captain Reed, this is Counselor Aaron of the Doline Republic. We hear you. Are you truly here to help us? The voice that came back was perfectly calm and collected. It's the only reason we're here. We received your call 3 days ago and came as fast as we could. Tell me the situation. Aaron laid it all out. The savage Cravath invasion, the relentless orbital strikes, the millions already lost, and the final ground invasion that was now just hours away. On his tactical display, he saw the unknown ships begin to shift, flowing into an attack pattern. Understood, Reed said after he finished. We are going to help you, but you need to brace yourselves for what comes next. We will engage the Cravath, and the fight is going to get intense. Look, our methods might seem a little intense, but I promise you, we won't let them hurt another one of your people. Do we have your permission to engage? Yes! Oh, gods, yes, please. Just do whatever it takes. Understood. One last thing. Keep your ships clear of the battle zone. We don't want any friendly fire. After a brief silence, the officer added, Looks like the Cravath are hailing us. This ought to be good. Commander Drexen was savoring a glass of expensive liquor, toasting his easy victory. His ground troops were poised for the final invasion. Then this mystery fleet just had to warp in. At first, it was an annoyance. Now, it was just a bit of entertainment. Unidentified ships. You are addressing Commander Drexen of the Cravath Dominion. You are interfering in a sovereign military action. State your identity and purpose, then vacate this system immediately. This is Captain Reed of the United Earth Fleet, a calm voice replied. We're responding to a distress call from the Doline Republic. You're the one who needs to power down your weapons and leave. Drexen actually laughed. Earth? Never heard of it. You must be some backwater species from the outer rim who doesn't get how the galaxy works. This system is ours now. Scram, before we turn your little ships into space dust. I gave you a chance to leave peacefully. Reed's voice came back, completely devoid of emotion. Remember that. The line went dead. Still grinning, Drexen ordered 3 of his battle groups to advance and utterly crush the newcomers. It was supposed to be a simple mop-up job. 30 state-of-the-art warships against a handful of nobodies. Commander Drexen smirked as his fleet powered forward, their plasma cannons glowing, ready to melt through primitive armor like a hot knife through butter. His computers locked onto the enemy ships. He leaned back, anticipating the fireworks. But the humans fired first. Drexen's smirk vanished. The tactical display flared into a chaotic nightmare. These primitives, they weren't using energy weapons. They were launching solid chunks of metal from railguns and firing missiles with explosive warheads, weapons the rest of the galaxy had banned centuries ago for being too savage, too barbaric. And they were horrifyingly effective. One of his cruisers took 3 railgun slugs straight to its bow. Its energy shields might as well have been made of paper. The metal slugs ripped through the armor plating and just kept going, punching clean through the entire ship and out the other side. The cruiser was literally torn in half, its crew and atmosphere venting into the cold, silent void. Drexen stared, completely dumbfounded, as his fleet was ripped to shreds. The human weapons were absolutely devastating. Another one of his destroyers took a direct hit from a single, ugly-looking missile that burrowed deep into the engine room before detonating. The explosion was so bright on the monitor that it made Drexen's eyes water. "Return fire!" Drexen bellowed. "All ships! Concentrate fire on their lead vessel!" The Cravath fleet unleashed a torrent of superheated plasma that screamed across the blackness of space, a wave of pure energy that should have vaporized anything in its path. The human flagship took the entire blast head-on. Drexen leaned in, expecting the ship to boil away into nothing, but it didn't. Where the plasma struck, the ship's armor simply glowed white-hot. Huge chunks of it melted and sloughed off, only to reveal a second solid layer of armor underneath. The ship didn't even slow down. It just soaked up a hit that would have shattered any other vessel and kept on firing. "By the stars, what are those ships made of?" someone on his bridge whispered in horror. The entire battle was over in just 14 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 30 of Drexen's prize ships were nothing but drifting scrap metal. The humans hadn't lost a single one. A few were scarred, but all of them were still combat-ready. On the human bridge, Captain Dan watched the last enemy icon blink out. "Good," he thought. "Maybe now they're ready to talk." "Captain, the Cravath commander is hailing us again." "Put him on screen." Drexen's face appeared, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered shock. "What are you?" he stammered. "We're humans," Dan said simply. "We're from a planet called Earth, and we don't put up with bullies. You use kinetic weapons, explosives. Your ships don't even have proper shields. You fight like barbarians." "No," Dan corrected him softly. "We fight like people who have something to protect. Now I'm giving you one last chance. Stand down. Leave this system, or we will remove you." "I have 300 ships," Drexen blustered, but his voice was trembling. "And we just took out 30 of them in under 15 minutes, Dan shot back. "Do you really want to find out what happens when we stop holding back?" He leaned toward the camera, his voice low and steady. "Let me teach you something, Commander. Back on Earth, we have an old saying. Never corner something meaner than you. You picked a fight with the Dolene, a peaceful race. That was your first mistake. Your second mistake was still being here when we showed up." Drexen's 4 eyes stared back as if he were seeing a ghost. "The entire galaxy will hear about this." "Good," Dan said with a firm nod. "I hope they do. Let them know that when someone calls for help, Earth answers. Now, get out." The connection cut. Dan watched as the Cravath fleet slowly and very carefully began to turn around and retreat. Well, most of them. Drexen hadn't run away completely, but his fleet was now moving with a hesitation that was close to fear. They had just received a very painful lesson in respect. "Captain," the comms officer reported, "we have a channel open from the Dolene. Counselor Aaron is asking what we plan to do next." Dan gazed down at the planet below. It was scarred from orbit, cities burning, but its people were still fighting. "Tell him we're just getting started." Miles away, Colonel Ann Price watched the Dolan homeworld grow larger in the viewport of her drop pod. She could see their cities. Some were still standing, others were nothing but smoldering ruins. The Cravath had landed their occupation force 2 days ago and now controlled nearly 40% of the planet. That was about to change. "All units, this is Colonel Price. We are about to show these Cravath what happens when you invade someone's home. Remember your training. Remember why we're here. And remember that every civilian you save is another victory." The drop pods launched from the human carriers in massive waves, 2,000 Marines in the first wave, with another 5,000 right on their heels. The pods were designed to mimic the energy signature of missiles on Cravath sensors. By the time the invaders realized what was actually falling from the sky, it would be far too late. Anne felt that familiar jolt as her pod slammed into the atmosphere, rattling violently. The heat shields glowed a brilliant cherry red. Then, with a deafening roar, the retro rockets fired and the pod hit the ground, cracking the pavement beneath it. The door blew open, and Anne was already moving before the smoke cleared. They had landed in the middle of a city park. Cravath troops were everywhere. They had been using the park as a staging ground, never imagining for a second that an attack could come from directly above. Anne raised her rifle and fired. Humans had a few natural advantages that most alien species never understood until it was too late. Earth's heavy gravity meant that on worlds with lighter gravity, every human was stronger and faster. Compared to the Cravath, they moved like blurs of motion. She sprinted across the park in seconds, her rifle firing in short, precise bursts. Every round hit its mark. The Cravath scrambled to return fire, but they were hopelessly outclassed. Anne's squad hit their position from 3 different directions at once, using tactics the Cravath had never encountered. They didn't just stand in the open and trade blaster shots like so-called civilized soldiers. They used cover. They used flanking maneuvers. They were in constant motion, a whirlwind of deadly efficiency that was impossible to pin down. A Cravath officer tried to rally his panicked soldiers, and Anne put 2 rounds in his chest for his trouble. He went down like a sack of rocks. The rest of his squad turned and ran. The Marines gave chase. "Command, this is Price. Landing zone is secure. We are beginning to sweep the city." High above, in orbit, Admiral Cross conducted the violent symphony. The Navy was handling the space battle while the Marines dismantled the ground forces piece by piece. It was a war on 2 fronts that the Cravath were completely unprepared for. Drexen had gambled everything on his ground invasion, leaving his fleet in orbit outnumbered and outgunned. Down on the surface, his ground troops were being systematically erased by an enemy that fought with a ferocity they simply could not comprehend. "Commander, casualty reports are coming in from the planet," an officer said, his voice shaking. "The human ground forces, they're unstoppable." Drexen brought up the combat footage, and a cold dread washed over him. Human soldiers were moving through the city with terrifying speed, clearing entire buildings in minutes. They set up deadly ambushes that his troops walked straight into, and they never, ever stopped. One video clip showed a human Marine taking 3 direct hits from a plasma rifle. The soldier fell. Drexen watched, assuming he was out of the fight. But he wasn't. The Marine just got back up. His body armor had stopped 2 of the shots, and the 3rd had gone straight through his shoulder. It was a complete nightmare. The Cravath invaders weren't just winning. They were rubbing our noses in it. They'd taken over a hospital, packed it with civilian hostages, and turned it into their command center. They thought it made them untouchable. And when my squad finally fought our way to the front lines, we saw our soldiers getting shot, slapping a quick med patch on the wound and just diving right back into the fight. One of the local officers looked at me, his eyes wide with horror, and whispered, "They just don't stop." But charging in wasn't an option, not with families trapped inside. This called for something different, something smarter. I gathered my team. "All right, listen up," I said, my voice low. "We're going in quiet. No grenades, no heavy blasters. We get the people out first. Then we take out the trash." We found a maintenance tunnel and slipped inside, moving like shadows even with all our gear. We've trained our whole lives for moments like this, and we were about to show them what humans are made of. The Krebeth patrols walking the hospital halls never saw us coming. They were used to fighting armies that announced themselves with loud, flashy energy blasts. They had no idea how to handle ghosts. My Marines were forged in the toughest places Earth had to offer, from scorching deserts to frozen Arctic wastes. We took out the guards with silenced rounds and combat knives, a brutal ballet of silent, terrifying efficiency. We cleared 3 entire floors before a single alarm was raised. We found the civilians in the basement, a dark, damp space packed with nearly 200 dolphin, mostly mothers clutching their children. Their eyes were huge with fear. I slid my helmet off, letting the low light soften my face. "We're here to get you out," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Just stay close to my team and be as quiet as you can." A little dolphin girl, maybe 6 years old, looked up at me with tears rolling down her cheeks. "Are you the Guardians?" she whispered. "From the old stories?" I cracked a tired smile. "Something like that, kid. Come on," I urged them gently. "Let's get you folks home." The evacuation was a work of art, a masterclass in controlled chaos that took only 20 minutes. My team guided all 200 civilians through the hidden tunnels to where the Dolphin emergency crews were waiting. The second the last child was clear, we turned right around and went back in. That's when the Krebeth commander finally realized he'd made a fatal error. We had sealed every exit. We had jammed all his communications. He was caught in his own trap. My voice suddenly boomed from the hospital's internal speakers, cold and amplified. "Surrender now, and you will be granted the protections of the galactic rules of war. Resist, and you will be eliminated. You have 2 minutes to decide." The commander chose to fight. It was the last choice he ever got to make. My teams breached the command center from 4 directions at once. The room exploded into a hurricane of blinding light and choking smoke from flashbangs and stun grenades. The Krebeth soldiers panicked, firing their weapons blindly into the chaos. But for us, wearing thermal goggles, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The firefight was over in 90 seconds. I stood over the Krebeth commander who was on the floor, wounded but alive. "You're going to answer for every single thing you did here," I told him. "Every civilian you terrorized, every law you broke. You're going to stand trial." He spat on the floor. "You humans don't follow rules. You're just savages." "No," I corrected him calmly. "We're just better at this game than you are. There's a big difference." I nodded to my squad. "Get him and the others to the detention area. Make sure the medics patch them up. We are not them." The battle for the planet raged on for another 18 hours. By the time it was over, the Krebeth invasion force was completely broken. Some surrendered. Others made a mad dash for their ships, only to be turned into space dust by our waiting Navy fleet. The rest fought to the bitter end and died for nothing. High above in orbit, Admiral Cross was reviewing the casualty reports. We had 37 Marines wounded, and tragically, 5 killed in action. The Krebath, on the other hand, had lost over 10,000 soldiers on the ground and 50 ships in orbit. Dan stood beside her on the bridge of the flagship, the Valiant. "The Ragnarok is ready, Admiral," she reported. "The Ragnarok. Our ace in the hole, kept hidden from the main fight. But Drexen, the Krebath fleet admiral, still had his primary battle group of over 100 heavy cruisers. He was running, but he hadn't surrendered yet." "Then let's give him a reason to," Helen said, her voice as solid as steel. On the main view screen, the Ragnarok slid into view. It wasn't just a ship, it was a monster, easily twice the size of anything else in our fleet. Its main weapon was a massive spinal-mounted mass accelerator that ran the entire length of its hull. It was designed to fire a 10-ton slug at a ridiculous percentage of the speed of light. The targeting system locked onto the retreating Krebath formation. Helen gave the order. The Ragnarok fired. The projectile shot across the blackness of space in less than a heartbeat. It hit the lead Krebath dreadnought dead center. The kinetic impact was so immense that the warship didn't even explode. It just vanished. But the slug kept going. It ripped through a second dreadnought, then a third, a fourth, a fifth, and a sixth. 6 capital ships, gone in a single silent instant. From the bridge of his own flagship, Drexen watched the impossible happen. A feeling he'd never experienced in his long, decorated career washed over him. Pure, gut-wrenching terror. He slammed his fist on the comms panel. "All ships, cease fire. I said, stand down." He frantically tried to open a channel to the human fleet. "We surrender," he choked out, his voice shaking. "Unconditionally. We surrender. Just, please, make it stop." Dan's face appeared on his screen, her expression carved from stone. "Power down all weapon systems. Prepare to be boarded. Any failure to comply will result in your immediate and total annihilation. Is that clear?" Drexen could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. "Yes, perfectly." The channel went dead. Dan turned to Helen. "It's over. We won." Helen looked down at the scarred planet below, a world battered and bruised, but finally free. "No," she said softly, "they won. We just gave them a fighting chance." Down on the surface, Aaron walked through the rubble of what used to be his city. Human Marines were everywhere, but they weren't acting like conquerors. They were acting like rescuers. He saw one team carefully digging through a collapsed building, gently pulling survivors from the debris. He watched a human medic treating a tiny, injured dolphin child with the same focus she would give one of her own. Lissa found him there among the ruins. "The beacon, it really worked," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The guardians from the stories, they're real." "They aren't guardians, Lissa, they're soldiers," Aaron replied, his gaze fixed on a young Marine who couldn't have been more than 20, carrying an elderly Dolene woman toward a medical tent. "But maybe," he added with a slight smile, "that's exactly what a guardian is supposed to be." The story of what happened in Dolene space spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Ambassador Thesson watched the Galactic Council chamber explode into pure chaos. Delegates from 200 different species were on their feet, shouting, pointing fingers, and demanding to know what had just happened in some forgotten corner of the galaxy. The battle footage was playing for the third time on the main display. Human warships cutting through the Krebath fleet with terrifying grace. Human marines moving through shattered cities like apex predators. And then came the final, chilling clip. The human supership, the Ragnarok, firing its unbelievable weapon, wiping out 6 enemy flagships in a single, silent, devastating shot. Every representative in that room had a different reaction. Some looked on in horror, others with a strange sense of awe. And for a few desperate species, it looked an awful lot like hope. "This is exactly what we've always feared," roared Councillor Van of the Peltherin Union. "The humans have shown a military power that goes beyond our worst nightmares. Their weapons are barbaric. Their tactics are brutally efficient. They are a threat to the stability of this entire galactic community." "They also just saved millions of lives," a calmer voice cut in. It belonged to Councillor Mira of the Helen Federation. "The Krevath were committing genocide, and all this council did was talk. Earth answered a cry for help and stopped a massacre." "How is that a threat?" "Because they're from a death world," Van shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. "Don't you get it? They evolved on a planet where everything was trying to kill them. Their world has nearly twice the standard gravity. Their storms could tear our cities apart in minutes. Their native animals would give our best soldiers nightmares. They are built for violence in a way we can't even begin to imagine." Finally, Ambassador Thesson stood. "I was the one who advised Earth against this. I told them the galaxy would condemn them for their ferocity. But I was missing a huge piece of the puzzle." He brought new footage up on the screen. "I thought they'd be monsters. I expected them to kill without mercy. I want every one of you to see this." The screen showed a human marine, covered in dirt and grime, gently cradling a small, Dolphine child as he carried her out of a burning building. The next clip showed human medics treating wounded civilians before they even looked at their own soldiers. A third showed human engineers already helping to rebuild a hospital that had been destroyed. "They fight like demons," Thesson announced, his voice ringing with conviction. "But they protect like angels." Every single after-action report from the Dolan system painted the exact same picture. The humans were fierce when they had to be, but compassionate whenever they could be. They played by the established rules of war. Even when their enemies spat on those rules, they treated their prisoners with dignity under galactic law, and they put civilian lives ahead of their own military objectives. He let that sink in, the truth of it washing over the stunned council chamber. "Maybe," he said softly, "it's time we stopped being afraid of them." But Van wasn't buying it. One good act doesn't wipe out 2 centuries of very justified fear. "Then let's talk about the other problem," a different counselor added. "An Avish, a species known for being master merchants. For 200 years, Earth has been locked away by a quarantine. Every piece of technology they have, they invented completely on their own. Our intelligence shows their weapons are, in some cases, centuries ahead of anything we've got. Their ships are tougher, and their soldiers are deadlier. If we keep them penned in, they're only going to get stronger, and our fear will grow right along with them." Ven was floored. "Are you actually suggesting we just drop the quarantine?" The Avish counselor fired back. "I'm suggesting we consider it, because the only thing more frightening than a powerful species with a massive army is a powerful species that feels trapped in a cage. I'd much rather have them as allies than as enemies who despise us." The debate raged on back and forth. Thesson leaned back in his chair, just taking it all in. They could argue for days, maybe even weeks, but he knew the decision was already made. Everyone in that room knew it. Earth had just proven they were a force that couldn't be contained. The only real question left was whether the galaxy would be wise enough to welcome them or stupid enough to stand in their way. Half a galaxy away, in the cavernous throne room of the Kreveth Dominion, Emperor Vorith was staring at the battle reports. For a Kreveth, Vorith was ancient. He'd lived through 3 major wars and had been on the winning side of 2. He understood power, but more importantly, he knew when he was looking at an opponent he could never hope to defeat. The data from the Drexen fleet was brutally clear. The humans were better in almost every conceivable way. "What were our final losses?" Vorith asked his war council, his voice barely a whisper. 7 capital ships, my emperor, roughly 300 support craft. Over 15,000 ground troops are either lost or captured. The councilman hesitated. "And the humans?" "They lost 5 soldiers in the ground engagement. 37 were wounded. They didn't lose a single ship. A few took some cosmetic damage, but every last one is fully operational." Vorith closed his tired old eyes. "Send a diplomat to Earth," he commanded. "Tell them the Dominion wishes to discuss terms." One of his advisors was completely bewildered. "Terms, my emperor?" "Peace terms, surrender terms, whatever they want to call them. We are done fighting these people. It's a war we cannot win." The room fell into a dead silence. The Kreveth Dominion did not surrender. They conquered. But Vorith had lived this long by knowing exactly when to fold his hand. "My emperor, what of our honor?" "Our honor is worthless if our entire species is wiped from the stars," Vorith snapped back. "I've seen the footage. I know what their weapons can do. If we continue this fight, they will come to our homeworld, and they will burn it to the ground. We made a grave error when we attacked the Dolene. We are going to correct that error immediately, before it costs us everything." The meeting took place 3 days later on a neutral space station. Vorith sent his top negotiators, who walked in expecting the usual political dance, concede a little territory, pay a token fine, and shake hands. Captain Dan Reed, representing the humans, didn't bother with pleasantries. He sat down directly across from the Kreveth and got straight to the point. "This is what we want," he said, his voice cold and flat. "A full and immediate withdrawal from all Dolene territory. You will pay for 100% of the reconstruction costs. Any Kreveth officers found to have violated galactic law will be tried for war crimes, and you will issue a formal, public apology to the Dolene people." The lead Kreveth negotiator just gawked at him, utterly speechless. "Those terms are excessive." "Those terms are a gift," Dan retorted. "Your forces were committing genocide. By galactic law, we could demand far more. We could have your entire command structure on trial. The Council will never approve terms this severe. The Council had its chance to stop you. They did nothing while you burned worlds. We stopped you. So frankly, we don't give a damn what the Council thinks." Dan leaned forward, his gaze locking onto the negotiator. "Here's what you need to understand. Earth doesn't want your planets. We have no interest in ruling you. We just want you to stop preying on people who can't fight back. You can either agree to these terms, or our next conversation will happen in orbit of your homeworld." The negotiator's face went pale. You would invade us?" "Only if you force our hand," Dan said calmly. "We would strongly prefer peace, but we are absolutely prepared for war if that's the only other option." The Krevath agreed to every single demand. Vorith had already instructed them to take any deal that ended the fighting. The humans were simply too dangerous to provoke. News of the stunning agreement flashed across the galaxy within hours. The Krevath Dominion, one of the most feared military powers in known space, had completely and utterly surrendered to a species most of the galaxy hadn't even heard of a week ago. The Galactic Council convened again. This time, there wasn't a debate. The vote was swift and unanimous. They officially lifted the 200-year-old quarantine on Earth. They didn't have a choice. Trying to keep humanity caged was no longer just impossible, it was a suicidally terrible idea. Thesson traveled to Dolene space personally to give Admiral Helen Cross the news. She was on the bridge of her flagship, overseeing the massive reconstruction effort. "So that's it? We're free to travel now?" Helen asked. "Yes," Thesson replied. "You have unrestricted access to Council space. You can open trade routes, participate in diplomacy, and have a voice in all Council matters." Thesson paused for a second. "You should know, however, that most species are still terrified of you." "Because we're good at fighting?" Helen asked. "Because you're good at whatever is required," he corrected. "Fighting, defending, rebuilding. You adapt in ways most of us can't fathom. You didn't just survive a death world that should have extinguished you, you thrived on it, and it made you stronger." Thesson glanced out the viewport at the planet below, where human engineers were working side by side with Dolene crews. "The galaxy has never seen anything like your species. Some will resent you for it, others will admire you, but I guarantee you no one will ever forget what you did here." Helen kept her gaze fixed on the planet, which was slowly healing. "We didn't do any of this to make people afraid," she said quietly. "We did it because it was the right thing to do." "I know," Thesson said, "and that's what truly frightens them. You aren't conquerors. You aren't driven by profit. You are idealists with more than enough firepower to enforce your ideals. The galaxy has no idea how to handle that." "They'll learn," Helen said with a faint smile. "Or they won't. Either way, we're here to stay, and the next time someone out there needs help, we'll answer the call." Thesson returned to the Council headquarters. In his final report, he recommended humanity be granted full membership status. The motion passed, but by a razor-thin margin. Yet even as the Council was casting their votes, a wave of communications was already flooding toward Earth. Messages from dozens of smaller worlds, all asking for the same thing, an alliance. What would you do if your world was burning to the ground and the most powerful governments in the galaxy just stood by and watched? That was the nightmare my people were living. But then our last desperate distress call reached a forgotten corner of the universe, and the one species everyone had written off as monsters. They answered. So what happens when your only saviors are the galaxy's boogeymen? You're about to find out. In just 1 week, humanity's reputation did a complete 180. They went from being scary legends on a quarantined planet to the only ones who showed up when it mattered, the heroes who stood up for the little guy. As Admiral Cross sifted through a mountain of new alliance requests, a smile crept across her face. This changed everything. It had only been 6 months. Walking through the rebuilt streets of his capital city, Aaron was still in shock. Human engineers had shared their incredible technology without asking for a single credit in return. Buildings that should have taken decades to restore were already standing tall. The scars of the war were still there, but now they finally had a chance to heal. Today was a huge deal. He and his chief scientist, Lisa, were invited to tour a human warship, the UES Valiant, Captain Reed's flagship. As their shuttle docked and the airlock hissed open, Aaron stepped into a reality his mind could barely process. The ship's interior was impossibly vast, with corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. Everything was designed for function, not beauty. There was no art, no elegant trim, just clean, cold steel and a powerful sense of purpose. A man named Dan greeted them. "Counselor Aaron, it's an honor to welcome you aboard." "The honor is ours, Captain," Aaron replied, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved our world. We have a debt to you that we can never truly repay." Dan looked almost embarrassed by the praise. "We just did what anyone should have," he said, shifting gears. "Come on, let me give you the tour." As they walked, Aaron observed the human crew. They all moved with an intensity and speed that suggested they came from a world with far stronger gravity. They were a constant storm of focused activity. Just watching them was almost tiring. Lisa, naturally, was firing off 1,000,000 questions a minute. "How does your artificial gravity generator work? What's the fuel source for your reactors? What kind of shielding protects you from cosmic radiation?" Dan answered every single one with incredible patience. Some of their tech was so far beyond them, it seemed like magic, but other parts were so brutally simple it was almost frightening. For centuries, the galaxy had a file on humanity, a list of problems they claimed were unsolvable. The humans just decided to solve them anyway. Looking down at his homeworld from the ship's observation deck, Aaron saw a planet finally coming back to life. The scorched lands were slowly turning green again. "I have to ask," Aaron said, breaking the quiet. "Why? Why did you help us? You owed us nothing. You didn't know we existed until our distress call. Why would you risk so much for total strangers?" Dan, the human captain, was silent for a long moment. "Have you ever been completely and utterly alone? So alone that the rest of the universe is terrified of you?" Aaron could only shake his head. Earth was put under a galactic quarantine for 200 years. We were officially labeled too dangerous for contact. So we built our fleet and trained our soldiers to defend the only family we had, each other. When your signal came through, we heard a voice crying out in the dark, and we knew no one else was coming. We remembered what it felt like to be left for dead. Dan looked Aaron directly in the eyes. "We came because someone had to. Because when you're terrified, alone, and about to be extinguished, it shouldn't matter what you look like. When you scream for help, someone ought to answer." Standing next to Aaron, Lisa quietly wiped away a tear. "The old legends, they were true," she whispered. You really are guardians. We're just people, Dan said softly, trying to do what's right. They spent another hour aboard the Valiant. Dan took them to the medical bay, where human doctors were already creating new treatments for his people's injuries. He led them through the engine room, where human and Dolan engineers were sketching out designs for new hybrid systems, merging the best of both their technologies. Then he brought them to the memorial wall, a simple plate of dark metal engraved with the names of the 5 Marines who didn't make it back. "We never forget a single one," Dan said, his voice heavy. "Not one." On the shuttle ride back down to the planet, Lisa's eyes widened as she looked at her data slate. "The human government. They just sent a formal proposal," she breathed. "It's a complete mutual defense pact, a military alliance, technology sharing, even cultural exchanges. What should we do?" A wide grin spread across Aaron's face. "I think," he said, "we sign it before they can possibly change their minds. We've just found the best allies this galaxy has ever known." The treaty was signed a week later, marking the first official alliance between humans and another species. Earth's President Garcia attended in person, along with Admiral Cross and Captain Reed. The ceremony was broadcast live across both of their homeworlds. "Today, we forge a bond that was born in the fires of war," President Garcia declared to the roaring crowds. "The Dolan people called for help, and Earth answered. From this day forward, we promise to stand as one, to protect each other, and to build a brighter future together." Aaron's hands shook slightly as he added his signature to the historic document. Lisa stood right beside him, a representative for their entire scientific community. The second it was done, the public square exploded with joy. It was an incredible scene, Dolan and humans celebrating not just survival, but the beginning of a brand new hope. The ripple effect across the galaxy was almost instantaneous. Soon, other species started reaching out to Earth. First, it was the scrappy traders from the Helon Federation, then the peaceful farmers of the Evish Collective, and even the isolated mining colonies in the Outer Rim. They all shared something in common. They were tired of being pushed around or ignored by the big galactic powers, and they all wanted what the Dolan now had, a partner and a protector in humanity. Admiral Cross suddenly found herself in charge of a completely new kind of fleet, which they called the Terran Defense Initiative. It wasn't just human ships anymore. It was a vibrant mix of vessels from a dozen different races. They trained together, they patrolled the trade lanes together, and they became a symbol of something the galaxy hadn't seen in a long time. An alliance built not on power or greed, but on the simple principle that the strong have a duty to protect the weak. The Galactic Council watched all of this with a mixture of awe and anxiety. Some members were glad that the Terran Defense Initiative was finally bringing stability to the more chaotic sectors. Others grew nervous as Earth's sphere of influence expanded like a supernova. But no one could argue with the results. Piracy rates plummeted to all-time lows. Petty border disputes that had been simmering for centuries were suddenly being settled at negotiation tables, with human diplomats acting as mediators. Thesson, the Council's chief diplomat, made a trip to Earth, the first since the quarantine had been lifted. He toured the world that had haunted the galaxy's nightmares for ages. He saw the impossible cities they had carved out of a brutally hostile planet. He gazed upon towering mountain ranges and violent oceans that would make most other species physically ill. He witnessed a world that had tried everything to destroy its own children and had failed completely. President Garcia met him in a garden that, by all logic, should not have been able to exist. The gravity was a constant, crushing weight, and the weather was a chaotic, unpredictable force. Yet, it was stunningly beautiful. So, Garcia started with a small smile. "Are you convinced we aren't monsters yet?" "Madam President, I was never convinced you were monsters," Thassan answered honestly. "I was afraid of what you might become if you ever decided to be." He looked up at the planet's brilliant blue sky. "I get it now. I see why you fight so hard. This world taught you that survival requires strength, but it also taught you that just surviving isn't enough. You need a family, a purpose. You need something worth fighting for." "We're far from perfect," Garcia admitted. "We've made our share of terrible mistakes, and I'm sure we'll make plenty more." "But you try," Thassan interrupted. "That is what makes all the difference. You see something wrong and you act. You see suffering and you help. The galaxy has been missing that for a very, very long time." They finished their walk in a comfortable silence. Later that evening, Thassan submitted his official report. His recommendation was brief and to the point. Welcome humanity into the galactic community with open arms. They have earned their place at the table. Miles and miles away, on a remote monitoring station in the deep dark, a new alarm began to scream. A distress beacon had just been activated. It was coming from a species known as the Thanari. They were being overwhelmed by raiders, their defenses were about to fail, and they were begging for anyone at all, to help them. The emergency beacon cut through Admiral Cross's focus as she reviewed fleet deployment charts. She read the incoming message, her eyes widening just a fraction before she read it again to be certain. The Thanari system. A 3-week journey, even with engines pushed to their limits. She didn't hesitate for a second. Her orders echoed through the ship's comms, crisp and clear. "Scramble all available ships, immediate and full deployment. We have people in trouble." Within hours, the Terran Defense Initiative became a torrent of steel flowing into the blackness of space. Human battleships formed the vanguard, but this time something was different. They were flanked by sleek Doline cruisers with massive Avish freighters bringing up the rear, and nimble Hylian scouts weaving between the larger ships. It was an armada composed of a dozen different species, all united under one banner. Watching from the bridge of the Valiant, Dan could barely process the incredible sight. Imagine your world is ending. An enemy fleet darkens your skies, and everything you love is about to be wiped out. You send a desperate, hopeless call into the void, a final prayer to a silent universe. Now imagine someone answers. That's exactly what was happening. A fleet, bigger and more varied than any ever assembled, was tearing through space. It was a living, breathing testament to a promise now echoing between the stars. When you cry for help, we will come. Just before they made the jump, President Garcia's face lit up every screen. "Listen up, everyone," she said, her voice steady as a rock. "We are not going there as conquerors. We are guardians. We're not in this for land or glory. We're doing this because a world is on its knees, and we will not let them fall into the darkness alone. This is who we are." And just like that, they vanished in a silent, brilliant flash. If you want to see how the galaxy's most feared species became its greatest heroes, stick with me. Back on that small blue marble, once considered the galaxy's most dangerous place, a new story was being written. From his office window, Aaron watched the fleet's light trails fade from the sky like shooting stars. Lisa stood next to him, her eyes glued to a tracking screen. "They're really going to do this every single time, aren't they?" she whispered, full of awe. "Every single call for help." "Yes," Aaron replied softly, "because that's who they are now. The galaxy is already changing because of it." Far out in the deep, silent dark, that massive fleet raced onward, a spear of light aimed at a world in shadow. Sure, they had powerful weapons and incredible tech, but their deadliest weapon, the one thing no tyrant could ever defeat, was the simple idea they carried with them. The hope that when you've hit rock bottom and all seems lost, someone is coming for you. You see, on a little world they called Earth, a stubborn species, shaped by fire and endless struggle, had stumbled upon a fundamental truth of the universe. They learned that the greatest power wasn't in being a conqueror who takes whatever they want by force. It was in being a guardian who protects what they cherish. And so humanity, the legendary Deathworlders from the planet of nightmares, finally found their true calling among the stars. They became the people who answered the call. And because they did, the galaxy would never be a dark, lonely place ever again.